or wherever you get your podcasts. Washington Journal continues.
Here to discuss matters of elections, particularly come November, from the group he represents, is Cliff Albright. He's the co-founder and executive director of Black Voters Matter Fund. Mr. Albright, thanks for your time today.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Tell our audience about your group, exactly the reason it was formed and the things you involve yourself in.
Definitely, yeah. Black Voters Matter, first and foremost, is a power-building organization. And we believe in building power, and we're committed to building power in predominantly Black communities. And we believe that elections are one way of doing that, although by no means the only way of doing that. And so we've got a philosophy that says the best way to show that Black voters matter and to mobilize voters is to be engaged in organizing around our issues all throughout the year, not just around election time. And that in doing so, that we have got to prioritize supporting local groups that are on the ground, that are doing this work 365 days out of the year. Those are the trusted messengers that can best mobilize and educate and raise awareness around voters in our communities. We started in 2017, right around the time of the Alabama Senate race, which you may remember, between Doug Jones and Roy Moore, where people thought that there was no way that a Democratic senator would be able to win that seat. And yet we started the organization, we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in a short period of time and put it directly in the hands of local groups that were doing the mobilizing. And lo and behold, Black voters came out and shocked the country, right? And so it's a proven theory, right, that if we get those resources, along with other things like tools and technology, and every now and then traveling and supporting them using the Blackest bus in America, if we support those groups in doing their work, then we can really emphasize the issues that matter in our communities and encourage people to turn out and seize power.
I'm glad you brought that up, because as you engage with people, with your groups and things like that, when it comes to specific issues, what are they telling you as far as what's important to them about the people they choose to vote for?
Yeah, I mean, the issues that people in Black communities care about, we see the same things repeatedly. We do this work in around 20 states, 11 of which are states where we have direct staff members. But in all the communities that we go to, we hear the same issues over and over again, sometimes rated slightly different depending on what's happening. But, in Black communities, we care deeply about the issue of police violence, right? And criminal justice reform and mass incarceration. We saw that during the historic year of 2020, where we saw the historic level of protests that were taking place. That wasn't just about one moment or one incident. We see that repeatedly in the cities and the counties and in the states that we go to. But we also care about housing issues. We care about environmental justice issues, right? Not often when you talk about, necessarily just talking about climate change, but when you break it down, when you talk about, well, what does this mean? What does climate and energy mean for your utility bills, right, in Black communities? Or what does it mean about clean water, right? And let me remind everybody that Flint, Michigan still doesn't have clean water. But it's not just Flint, it's communities all across this country where we do our work. We care deeply about environmental justice issues. We care about voting rights, obviously, right? Our organization and our coalition partners just dedicated all of 2021 talking about this issue of voting rights, because we recognize that, as Senator Warnock said, that it is foundational, right? That it's the issue that lets us get advancement and progress on all the other issues that we care about in our community. So these are the kinds of issues that we hear our communities talking about. And obviously economic justice, employment, and wages. Let us remind everybody that Black unemployment has traditionally, ever since the statistic has been kept, has been at the rate of twice of white unemployment. And so we care about all these issues, and those are the issues that our communities want to hear people talking about and coming up with solutions to.
And when you talk to the people then, are you recommending specific candidates to them? Are you telling them who they should be voting for? And particularly, is it Republican and Democratic candidates alike that you emphasize or at least support?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually have a couple of organizational entities. And so sometimes we do that, what is strictly nonpartisan voter education work. We're raising awareness. We're informing voters around things like the many election changes that have taken place because of the voter suppression laws that have swept the country. And so informing people about those new laws and policies and requirements. And sometimes just letting people know like what the process is, reminding people about what election day is and when does early voting start and where can you go? And so a lot of what we do is just around informing people and motivating people to turn out and participate. But we do have our arm where we do get into some policies, right? Where, because sometimes in our communities, especially when they don't really have access to a lot of trusted information, communities need to know more about, well, who exactly are these candidates and what are their track records and who is best for our community. And we need to talk about specific policies, right? So sometimes we need to actual lobby and engage elected officials around issues like voting rights. We had whole campaigns where we were encouraging people, not just raising awareness about voting rights, but telling them, look, we need you to call your senator and tell them that you want voting rights passed. And so we do a combination of, depending on which organizational entity we're talking about, we do a combination of just informing and mobilizing and energizing voters around this process. But yes, sometimes we have to be a little bit more pointed in giving them solid information about the candidates. Never about a party, though, right? And this is very important because we're not just out here trying to lift up one party versus the other. If you look at the back of our shirts and on front of our shirts, it has this message that you see on the signs behind me that says Black Voters Matter. But on the back of almost all of our materials, what it says is three other words. It says, it's about us. So it's not about the parties and it's not about the candidates, right? We find that when you focus so much just on a party or candidate, that sometimes that turns our folks off. But when we center the discussion around our community and around our issues and around what people's hopes and dreams are, that's what it is that gets people engaged, especially when you're talking about voters who are community members that aren't usually engaged, right? Some people call them low propensity voters. We call them high opportunity voters, or we just call them folks that we just want to talk to and get involved. So we don't center the party and we really don't even center the candidates, but we center the issues.
This is our guest, Cliff Albright, joining us. And if you want to ask him questions about the group's efforts, particularly as they involve themselves with elections, issues regarding that, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 for Republicans and Independents, 202-748-8002. You can text us at 202-748-8003. Mr. Albright, two other questions. How is your group funded? And also, because of the name you use, are you affiliated in any way with the Black Lives Matter?
Right, great question. Let me answer the second part of that first. We are not affiliated with Black Lives Matter. We are a separate organization, although I'm pleased to say that we are very much in alignment with the principles of Black Lives Matter, right? And so we believe that Black Lives Matter. In fact, we were very intentional around why we call our organization Black Voters Matter instead of Black Votes Matter. And sometimes people get that name confused, and we tell them, look, there's a lot of people that care about Black votes who don't necessarily care about Black voters, right? They want our votes, they want to round us out, they want to count us like jelly beans in a jar, but they don't fundamentally care about the voters and about the communities that our voters come from. And so yes, we're in alignment with Black Lives Matter, but no, we're two completely separate organizations. The way that we're funded is actually through, we've got an incredible diversity of funding sources. Sometimes we get money from large foundations. Some of those are the foundations that you may have heard of, places like Ford Foundation or some of the other big name foundations. Sometimes just from individuals. The first fundraising that I did for this organization when we started, even long before the Alabama Senate race that I was mentioning, was actually at a school event for one of my older sons that was in high school, and it was at a parent event, and some parents went around and just raised up our first $1,000 that we used in our very, very, very first campaign. And so we've got a variety of sources from small donations that we get online every day, from $5 and $10 up to large donations coming from foundations and corporations.
Mr. Albright, then, how concerned are you as it stands right today about what the end result could be as far as the November elections are concerned? And as part of that, what's your group involved with leading up to that?
Yeah, no, we're very concerned. We're very concerned, but we're also optimistic, right? We're very concerned, obviously, because we know that there's still this big lie that is out there. There's still this people that are literally running on the notion of insurrection, running on the fact that they would have overturned the last election. And so we're very concerned just about like what's in the air. Even if you look at, our organization is based in Georgia. And if you listen to the first gubernatorial debate between those gubernatorial candidates on the Republican side, the very first sentence out of one of them was, "Let me be clear, the 2020 election was rigged and stolen," right? And so they're still very much relitigating 2020, but not just relitigating it. They are still trying to roll back all types of rights. And so when it comes to just the fundamentals of this democracy, and again, this isn't a partisan statement, this is just a statement of objective fact and reality, that you've got one party that is totally trying to tear apart the very notions of democracy. It's never been a perfect democracy, but to whatever extent it exists, you've got one party that is literally showing that they don't care for it, that it's just a cute notion, but that they're not really committed to it. And so we're very concerned, because the way that this election goes will also predict what happens in 2024, right? There's no scenario, given the current nature of the Republican Party, there's no scenario where if they gain control of the House, that you could actually have a Republican-controlled House that would certify an election where their candidate, a presidential election where their candidate doesn't win in 24. So we're very concerned about those issues, but we're also very concerned about all the other issues that are related to that, right? We need to look no further than last night and the leaked memo around reproductive rights. So women are under attack and have been under attack, right? So we're very concerned about those issues. We're concerned about economic justice issues. We're concerned about, like I said, about environmental issues. All of these are issues that, depending on how this election goes, could be issues where we're set back literally for decades in terms of policy.
Let's hear from our callers. We'll hear from Tom in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Independent Line. You're on with Cliff Albright, the co-founder and executive director of the Black Voters Matter Fund. Mr. Tom in Pittsburgh, go ahead, you're on.
First of all, you should be an independent, because Democrats take you for granted. That's a fact. That's why I'm an independent. And in fact, an African-American is the one who urged me to become an independent, because he was tired of being taken for granted. Number two, in terms of voter suppression, there's no voter suppression. If you're 18 and you're a legal citizen, you can vote. Now, suppression is because we don't have enough machines. But we found $30 billion to send to the Ukraine, didn't we? So if we can have $30 billion for the Ukraine, we should have money for machines so that people could vote.
Okay, that's Tom in Pennsylvania. Mr. Albright.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for the suggestion of being an independent. I don't think I said that I was a Democrat, and so I don't actually disagree with you. In fact, before starting Black Voters Matter years ago, where I lived in Selma, Alabama, historic Selma, Alabama, along with a group of friends and organizers, we actually organized a local third party because we were so independent. So I thank you for the suggestion of being more independent. In regards to voter suppression, I mean, I really don't know how to answer that, other than, you just got to believe what you see in front of your eyes, right? We've seen not everybody who's 18 necessarily has fair and free access to the vote. We've seen people being purged from voter rolls. In this state alone, we actually sued the state of Georgia because it was discovered that they had purged 200,000 voters who should not have been purged, because it was said that they had changed addresses, when in fact they had not changed addresses, but the state simply used the wrong vendor to verify addresses. And guess what? The disproportionate amount of those voters were actually Black. We've seen this repeated in state after state where they use these massive voter rolls, but that's voter purges. But that's just one form of the voter suppression, right? We've seen, and it's been documented, the voter suppression bills that have been passed in 19 states, cutting days of early voting, cutting access to drop boxes, cutting access to all types of other things, making it harder for people, voter ID, or making it harder for people to vote by mail. All of this is well documented. Not to mention, the policies, the use of policies that would actually allow people to overturn elections. Right here in the state of Georgia, the Republican Party is already using their latest law in order to target Fulton County. Because at the end of the day, you don't have to take over every county's board of elections. You could just take over one county's board of election, and that would tilt the scales in all of these elections that are usually razor thin margins. So, I'd love to have a longer discussion around voter suppression, but there's lots of information out there that documents the suppression that's been taking place and historically target at predominantly Black communities.
From Sean in Maryland, Republican Line, you're next.
Good morning, sir. I have a slight different take on that. Myself, I've been complaining here in Maryland because the Black vote is being overtaken by others. They just had us get real IDs, and we had to get those twice, and now they took our last names off the driver's license and started MD. That's one. I just got my son's learner's permit the other day. He's not even 18 yet. He's registered to vote in Maryland. They've been doing this with non-registered people and their IDs. So why don't you go through and make sure that the blacks that are voting are actually black people and just stop going with the colored thing? Because I was with you at first, but now I'm with this. We're being obfuscated by others. Most older black folks don't even like to vote because they think their vote doesn't count. So why don't you work on that and get them back to voting and get the people that shouldn't be, the non-citizens that you say that aren't voting, that are, out, and let the voter rolls count for the amount of people, the voters that are registered to vote in the state, not others.
Okay, that's Sean in Maryland.
Well, thank you, Sean. I appreciate the suggestion that we do more work to reach out to get more black folks to participate. Perhaps you've heard of the state of Georgia, where we did a pretty good job of mobilizing black voters that came out in record numbers in the midst of a pandemic, and not just flip the state in terms of the presidency, but also in terms of two Senate seats. So yeah, we do that work of educating, as I started off saying, we do that work of educating and mobilizing and talking to voters who often don't receive a door knock or don't receive a text message. These are the voters that aren't super voters that a lot of candidates in the party structure sometimes look past. So that's exactly the kind of work that we do, and we do it in states that a lot of people, take for granted and think that aren't competitive states, and we do it in counties, more importantly, that a lot of people ignore. Right? It's glad to hear that you live in Maryland, but we do this work in all the states that we do. If we were in Maryland, we wouldn't just be in Baltimore, but we'd be in some of those other smaller pockets that a lot of people ignore. Same thing in Georgia. And so, yes, we do that work of reaching out and touching voters and trying to get more people involved. That's the very reason that we exist as an organization. And I think our track record shows that we've done a pretty good job of it in regards to non-citizens voting. Again, that's simply not a thing, right? There's absolutely no evidence of that type of fraud taking place. In fact, the only fraud that we've seen over the past couple of years, since we've been hearing all this noise about fraud, has been cases like the one that recently came to light, the Trump supporter who used her, I think it was her dead mother's name to vote twice in an election. Those are the stories that we hear, but you don't hear that coming out of certain media outlets that like to talk about voter fraud, but when they see those types of examples, they don't have anything to say about it. But the thing about non-citizen voting is simply not a thing.
Mr. Albright, what would be your message to Democrats here on Capitol Hill? They tried several times to get voting rights legislation on the federal level passed, and no success on that front. What do you think the cause of that is, and what would be your message to legislators here?
Yeah, great question. I mean, we were very active all throughout 21, pressuring, not just the senators, but, also the White House. I myself was involved in civil disobedience along with our national coalition. I think I was arrested 4 or 5 times during the course of the summer or fall at various direct actions in front of the Senate offices and in front of the White House. So our message remains the same, right? This is not optional. We've got to have voting rights legislation at the federal level. We cannot continue to fight this state by state. We've got to have the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and they should not be giving up on it. We're thankful that they had a debate and a vote on it in January. That's something that would not have taken place without the pressure that came from voting rights organizations that would have been pushing for that all throughout 2021. And so we still have the same message. In fact, what we're saying is merging these two issues of the voting rights legislation and this election cycle, we're saying that we want to see candidates that are running, particularly for Senate, but at different levels as well. We want to see candidates that are running to sign a voting rights pledge that we're going to be advertising within the next days or weeks. We want to see them sign a voting rights pledge where they commit up front that they will, if elected and they go to DC, that they will support the Freedom to Vote Act, John Lewis Voting Rights Act, that they will support filibuster reform. Because otherwise, we're just in a situation, and DC statehood, I should mention DC statehood as well, because that's one of the oldest forms of voter suppression. We don't want to see a situation where we mobilize Black voters and we get certain turnouts in the Senate and Congress, and then we find out that in reality, we actually just sent 2 more mansions or 2 more cinemas, or manchinima, as I call them, that we send 2 more of those folks to the Senate who aren't going to move on those voting rights priorities. So we're trying to make sure that this issue stays front and center, even in the midst of this election cycles where there are so many issues being discussed. We cannot move voting rights off the stage. It's got to be a continued topic of discussion.
You mentioned those two senators. Both have said supportive things about voting rights, but both wouldn't go as far as changing the filibuster to do that. Why use that? Why use that tactic as far as a filibuster change to get that done?
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, you're not going to find 10 Republicans, 10 reasonable Republicans, 10 Republicans that live in this reality, in this parallel universe. You're not going to find 10 Republicans that are going to vote for voting rights. You know, for goodness sakes, that you couldn't find them to even investigate what happened on January 6th. So you're not going to find that. In fact, Joe Manchin repeatedly said, oh, they're out there, they're out there. And he came up with his own compromise. You know, keep in mind that the version of the bill that they wound up debating and voting on in the Senate wasn't the original version at the House poll. It was a compromise version that really was Joe Manchin's compromise. He couldn't find 10 of his Republican friends to even vote on his own compromise. It's simply not going to happen. You can't, the filibuster cannot work when you've got a party which is simply not committed to the notion of voting rights to begin with. And so the only way to get voting rights passed is going to be to modify the filibuster in order to let the 50 Democratic senators that did support it. Joe Manchin supported the bills, right? Kyrsten Sinema supported the bills. They just didn't support the filibuster reform. The only way to get it passed is if there's some type of filibuster reform to get that done. We're glad that the president belatedly came out in support of such filibuster reform when he gave his speech in Georgia in January. But we need both the White House and the Senate to continue that debate so that we can get to filibuster reform. And that's why we want these candidates to address this up front so that when they get there, that the filibuster no longer continues to be an issue, particularly in regards to voting rights. Although I will say there's some other issues. And again, just looking at last night, you're going to need the same thing if you're going to get the reproductive rights that have existed and been law of the land for 50 years. Now, the only way to truly protect that, given what it looks like the Supreme Court is about to do, is if there's some legislation dealing with that, and that's going to require filibuster reform.
Cliff Albright, our guest, the Black Voters Matter Fund. He serves as their co-founder and executive director. Democrats line, we'll hear from David in North Carolina. Hello.
Yes, I was just wondering why that. You know, you think black folks matter. I just want to know, just do a quick check on blacks, browns, women that are in our Congress and Senate. How many of them? They're not white people. You putting out a statement that is biased. You're having companies that you have bought into Black Lives Matter to supply you with your funds that you can try to overthrow our nation. I fought in the Navy. I mean, I served my time. I didn't see color when I was there. I saw a brother in arms that was defending our nation. Now I see people like you that are trying to tear us apart because you think that segregation is the way to go. Son, you're our problem.
Okay, David, North Carolina, thank you. Mr. Albright.
Sure. Well, thank you, David, for the call. You know, at the end of the day, you know, we say Black voters matter because it is Black voters who disproportionately have been treated like they don't matter, right? And we could go back to, you know, the origins of even where the Black vote comes from, right? We needed a 15th Amendment for a reason, right? Some people think that we didn't get the right to vote, Black folks, until 1965. There was actually a 15th Amendment after the Civil War, after the 13th, which ended slavery, after the 14th of granted citizenship. You would have thought that the 14th granting citizenship would have been enough, right? Because heck, you're a citizen, you can vote. But that wasn't enough to protect Black voters. And that's why a 15th was needed to specifically deal with not denying the vote on the grounds of race, right? And so we could go back that far to show that it's been Black voters that have been disproportionately treated wrongly when it comes to the vote. We can go all throughout the history of Jim Crow and segregation and how that showed up in regards to voting rights. But more importantly, we don't even have to go that far. We can look at the continued onslaught against Black voting rights. We can look at Florida in the year 2000, where Black voters were disproportionately impacted by voter suppression there, which literally impacted the results of the presidential election. We can look more recently at elections all throughout the country where you've seen in Black communities if you had the kinds of long lines that exist in Black communities, if you had that in white communities, then we wouldn't have to say Black voters matter, right? But the reality is that the things that we see, the long lines, the machines that don't work, the disproportional purges, the closing of polling places, and data shows us that when you close a polling place, the further you make somebody travel or make a community travel, the lower you have turnout in those communities. So if all these things existed equally in white communities, and we don't want to see it happen in white communities, we don't want to see it happen anywhere. But if all of these things existed in the white community at the same rates that they happen in the Black community, we wouldn't have to say that Black voters matter, right? We could just live it. The reality is that that's not the case, right? I can go to any community, and if you go to a white community on election day, and I've done this, you go to a white community on election day, you know, the notion of long lines in many of these communities, not all, you might find one every now and then, but for the most part, if you go to most predominantly white communities, you're not going to see 3-hour, 4-hour, 5-hour waits. You simply don't see it, right? But you see that traditionally and consistently in Black communities. So there's a reason we have to say Black voters matter. That's because we have been treated in such a way as to make it necessary to proclaim that. And we don't just proclaim it for the people that are doing wrong by treating us that way. We have to proclaim it for the folks that live in those communities so that they know that they matter, so that they know, regardless of how certain election officials may treat them, that they still matter, and that they still have power, and they have the power to control the politics in their communities. That's why we have to say that.
From Pat in Virginia, independent line, you're on with Cliff Albright. Hello.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. Listen, I just want to note that I listen to Fox News and what they're projecting to their consumers, and I listen to MSNBC, and between the two of them, there's only one talking about, you know, heavily into divorce, immigration, now abortion. And they're all indicating that the reason we're even talking about abortion is preserving a particular type of a race, if you will, because there are too many immigrants coming into this country, so we have to preserve a certain race. So, you know, by the year, 2040, that the minority won't be the majority type of thing. So they're trying to preserve white babies. That's why we're talking about this.
Mr. Albright, if you wanted to respond to that.
Yeah, I don't think I was having difficulty hearing that question, but I think I got the gist of it, in that a lot of this debate around, you know, abortions or even some of these other issues, I heard it say something about immigration, is really attached to, you know, this fear of the changing demographics. I think that was the gist of the question. And I think there's truth to that, right? That as the demographics are changing, I mean, heck, you need only look to one of the well-known conservative commentators who's just done a whole thing talking about male, you know, fertility and a certain type of tanning, to know that there is an obsession with reproductive rates and the demographic changes in this country. And that is driving a lot of the fears, whether it's fears around immigration or fears around voting and voting power. When you know that your group is no longer going to be the majority, then it'll cause you to all of a sudden start pursuing policies that suggest that majority rule no longer matters, right? That elections should no longer be about who actually gets more vote, but instead it can be about who can overturn an election because they've got the power to do so. That's a very dangerous place for us to be in. And anybody that thinks that that's something that's just that type of authoritarianism is just limited to being anti-Black or anti-brown or anything else needs to realize that with all forms of structural racism, it eventually spills over and pollutes the entire system. That's something that people have got to be very aware of. It can't just be about, we don't mind the cruelty. We just want them to be cruel to these folks, because when you support that type of cancer growing in your public sphere, it's only a matter of time before it affects everything.
Mr. Albright, because elections often are influenced by whoever's at the top of the ticket, I want to talk to you about President Biden for a bit. There was polling from Gallup talking about President Biden's approval level, particularly among Black Americans, starting at 87% back in January of 2021, that through June, that going down to 74% from July to August, and now 67% from September to March of this year. What do you think is happening about those dropping levels, and how much of that concerns you?
Yeah, I mean it's concerning, but at the end of the day, there are reasons for that, right? There are reasons for that, and some of them are legitimate, and some of them are kind of manufactured, right? You've got constant news out there talking about the economy and talking about inflation. I will say this: I've criticized President Biden for a lot of things, particularly in the space of voting rights, particularly in the space of police violence and police accountability, particularly in the space of even student debt forgiveness. But at the end of the day, that there has been more job growth during his brief time in office than what you saw, in a similar period during the Trump years, right? There has been some growth. Now, that is not across the board, right? So from the Black community, and you asked about, I think, about the Black approval ratings, what we're looking at is that as the rest of the country is coming out of this recession, however you define that's not impacting the Black community, right? As I said, Black unemployment still remains twice that of white unemployment. Black women were more harshly impacted by the economic downturn than any other group in the country. And so it's not enough to just say we're doing better. We want to see, the Black community wants to see, well, what are you doing in particular to deal with, the harsh realities, the harsh economic realities in our community. So there's some truth to that. But with that said, there's also, I talked about the manufactured part, right? All of the talk about inflation and as if that's something that is just something that's caused by wages being too high, instead of people actually dealing with it. One of my biggest frustrations is that that the media doesn't actually deal with it for what it is. It's not just this abstract rise in prices. Corporations are making record profits, even as we're talking about inflation. And so the way to translate inflation is literally that corporations are exceeding their profit margins in such a way that it's causing a manufactured increase in these prices. There's no sound structural reason for it to happen other than, there's no other way to say it, corporate greed. And so the message has got to be that you've got to deal with it as such. It's going to take bold action in order to call it out and come up with policies in order to deal with it. So part of the decline in the popularity that he's seen is because of some made up reasons. It's because COVID is still an issue. But why is it still an issue? Because you've had some people who have manufactured trying to keep it an issue because they refuse to support wearing masks and getting vaccinated and things of that nature. So some of it is manufactured, but some of it is very real, right? There hasn't been action on. There wasn't passage of voting rights. There hasn't been. The George Floyd bill for police accountability was not passed, and really wasted time for over a year dealing with Tim Scott as if he was a legitimate negotiator. That was never going to happen. And so time was wasted on that. Black community is concerned about that action. I mentioned the student debt forgiveness, right? We're waiting to see if he keeps his promise of at least the 10,000, and as others have suggested, even going as high as 50,000. That would have an immediate impact with Black voters, with young voters, right? And it has a racial justice component to it because of the way that debt is structured and who receives student loans in this country. You could reduce the racial wealth gap just by dealing with that one policy alone. So we're looking at these policies and we're wanting to see more action. That's what the Black community is saying to us. So we've got to deal with that. He's got to deal with it as a president. The party has got to deal with it. They've got to develop policy around it. But at the end of the day, even as we're holding them accountable, and this is the balancing act, we've got to hold folks accountable and make them be responsive to their base, right? But we've also got to, at the same time, make sure that our voters are very clear that while we have to push these folks to do right, that you got some other folks out here that are very much anti-Black. Right. And so there's a balancing act there. How do you call out one side that is directly has been in terms of policy against our interests, but not doing so in a way where you just become a cheerleader for some other folks? That's the delicate balancing act. That's why this takes deep conversations and deep organizing. This is not the kind of thing that can be done just with one text message or just with one radio ad. And that's why we've got to invest in the groups that are on the ground having those conversations, because they are the trusted messengers who best know the communities.
Let's hear from Eugene in North Carolina, Democrats line. Hi.
Hey, yeah, I want to maybe correct your guest. He said that he wasn't a Democrat, but words matter, and also in adding that there, you're telling the black community, actually right now, speaking out to them, and you dictating to them how to vote, rather than get the truth out there. That's what you need to be working on, the truth, and nothing but the truth. But we can't get the truth from neither station due to the fact of blocking. So why don't you work on that instead of trying to dictate to the people how to vote? Thank you.
Mr. Albright,
well, I don't think we dictate to anybody. In fact, if you know the communities that we do our work in, it's very hard, if not impossible, to dictate to anybody how they vote or whether or not they even go to vote. So I appreciate the caller thinking I've got that much power that I can dictate to black voters. We engage in having the kind of truth telling that he's talking about. And, I would have loved if he could, if there's something I said that was untrue, that he tell me which part of what I said is not true, whether it's regards to voter suppression or regards to economic justice or any of the other issues. We believe in that we've got to tell our communities the truth, even when it's a tough truth, right? And that we've got to have hard conversations. That's how we grow. That's how families have their discussions, right? You got to have some truth telling. So I agree with what the caller is saying. I just disagree that somehow we're just out here dictating to folks. We're about having conversations. We're about having a dialogue, and a dialogue is by definition a two-way conversation. We could not do this work simply by just telling people what to do. That wouldn't be received too well, right? I guarantee that in the communities where we do our work, people want to have some discussion, right? They want to know why you stand, where you stand. They want to know who's who and what's what. In fact, sometimes when we don't see turnout on some of the down ballot is because some voters don't really know a lot about the down ballot candidates, right? They haven't seen them at their doors. They haven't seen as many commercials, because a lot of those down ballot races don't spend as much on TV or radio or other types of advertising. So part of what we do is just try to get people the tools that they need so that they can get accurate information, so that they can know who the candidates are, so that they can know where their websites are and what this particular office does. And if we believe that if we get that information to our folks, and if we have some legitimate conversations from trusted messengers, then folks will ultimately make the right decisions that they need to make. When you look at 90% of black voters that tend to vote, Democratic in presidential or other elections, that's not because Cliff Albright is telling them out there, you got to vote Democrat, right? That's because they're looking at their issues. Black voters are smarter than that. People often insult black voters by thinking that we just go around dictating stuff to them. Black voters know what our interests are. And when we have accurate information and complete information, then we can make some pretty well-informed decisions. And so black voters tend to look at what the issues are and who the candidates are and what's their track record. And that's why we tend to vote in a certain way. You show me a Republican who right now would lead the vote to get voting rights passed and would actually lead legitimate police reform, not the way that Tim Scott did, but that would seriously lead on police reform or would support other racial justice issues. I'll say that's somebody I consider voting for. You can't find one. So it's not about me out here dictating.
Well, because you mentioned it the second time, what was wrong with Tim Scott's approach?
Yeah, I don't think it was ever an honest approach, right? Even if you look at the way that they handled, the way that he communicated after the approach, and for folks who don't know, you had Tim Scott, who along with Senator Cory Booker were in these negotiations over the George Floyd Act, and ultimately it falls apart. And then he says it's because Democrats wanted to defund the police. I mean, that's simply not an honest, response. And I think it's a symbol or a sign that all of those negotiations weren't really coming from a place of honesty and a place of really trying to solve the problem. It was really coming from a position of, well, we've got to at least act like we're trying to do something about this police accountability. After all, there's been a record summer of protest that took place in 2020, but it was never really with the intentions that they would actually have any real police accountability. As we saw, Cory Booker said that you even had law enforcement that were supporting some of the reforms that they were talking about, which, to be clear, even from my perspective, wasn't going far enough, right? But that it existed if there was a real honest negotiation taking place. But when Tim Scott, eventually pulled out and then tried to make the argument that it was because they were trying to defund the police, which we know wasn't part of the discussions, although I might like to see that, right? That wasn't a part of that discussion. And so it simply wasn't coming from a place of honesty and seriously trying to solve the solution, solve the problem.
Just to read you, he put out a statement after negotiations stopped. He said, I offered to introduce a bill that included areas of compromise, a bill that activists and law enforcement alike could have supported. Despite having plenty of agreement, Democrats said no because they could not let go of their push to defund our law enforcement. Once again, the left let their misguided idea of perfect be the enemy of good, impactful legislation.
Right, exactly. And again, in that statement, as he's done in other statements, in his responses to speeches, talking about that the Democrats were trying to defund the police when actually the exact opposite is what the case has been, that they've actually been trying to fund, including President Biden himself, who, again, sometimes I agree with and sometimes I disagree with. But, in his State of the Union speech, when he said fund them, fund the police, that was in exact opposition to what the movement of 2020 was calling for. Right. But again, you can't connect the dots between what the words and the policies that the president or Democrats in the Senate have actually said that they support and what Tim Scott has said they were trying to support. Those two things just simply don't square up.
Let's hear from Richard in Pennsylvania, Republican line.
Yes, sir. I'd like to take you back to your conversation on voter suppression. I hear a lot of, you might say, denigration of one party, voter suppression, all those comments. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with some compromise here? I'd like the guests to speak to the matter of voter ID, for one. What is wrong with the person using a voter ID to go in the polling place and prove who they are? I don't mind doing it. You do it every day. You go to a bank, you go to a hospital, you go wherever you go, and you need a voter ID. But there's a big problem with asking for a voter ID to go to vote. Could your guest comment on that?
Richard, thank you. We'll let our guest respond.
Yeah, so two points to that. First, on the issue of voter ID, in an ideal world, voter ID itself would not be an issue, right? It could be something that's subjective, whatever. Everybody has equal access to it, right? Fine. The reality is that that's not the reality. That's not what exists. Not everybody has equal access to it. Simply getting an ID in many communities, particularly in Black and marginalized communities, is difficult. I'll give you a perfect example because it's not just difficult because of economic reasons or random or side issues. I'll give you an example of Alabama. When Alabama first passed its photo ID law, when they passed it, they also simultaneously tried to shut down all of the departments of motor vehicles in the Black Belt counties of Alabama, right? So literally, as they were saying, you must get this ID, they shut down the very places where predominantly Black communities could get an ID, right? And so it's not just the notion of, oh, it's easy to show an ID, it's that the process of getting an ID and even choosing which IDs could be used in places like Texas and others, where they say you can use your gun permit, but students can't use their campus ID. The way that these voter ID policies are designed are often because they're targeting Black communities, brown communities, younger voters, and guess what? They're targeting all these populations that the people designing these policies know will vote a certain type of way, right? Will tend to vote more progressive or more democratic. So it's not that this voter ID thing just exists in isolation in a vacuum. It's because that there are other policies, the cost, the transportation, the access, which ones can be used that dictate which groups will be more likely to be able to produce it. The same way that the poll tax, which on the face of it was something that everybody had to pay. Everybody's got to pay the poll tax, right? But the way that it was designed in such a way to target lower income or no income Black voters. Same thing with literacy tests, same thing with all the other Jim Crow features that go back to the civil rights era or the pre-voting rights era, right? On the face of it, they were universal, but they were created in a way and implemented in a way where they targeted certain communities. So that's the first piece on the voter ID. But the bigger issue is this. that this debate, so often where you hear people challenging the notion of voter suppression, that's their favorite thing to point to is the voter ID, because they say, oh, this is reasonable, right? There are so many different dimensions to voter suppression. There's a whole spectrum of suppression that we talk about, which includes voter ID, but it also includes polling places being closed. It also includes cutting down early vote. It also includes drop boxes. It includes the requirements on how it is that you can even vote by mail, and a methodology, which, by the way, Republicans never really had an issue with, particularly in states like Florida, where Republicans traditionally use vote by mail. But then comes the most recent election where Black voters use it in record numbers. And then all of a sudden, DeSantis and the Republicans in the state wanted to attack and make it more difficult to use vote by mail. So there's all these different things up to and including being able to take over boards of election and criminalizing election officials and all sorts of other things. That's an entire spectrum of election intimidation at the polling places, right? In Texas, where they made it okay for people to be able to go and surveil and harass voters, even being able to videotape them. And then they went out not only trying to pass that, but then they went out and actively started recruiting some right-wing activists, trying to get them to do exactly that, to go to polling places and intimidate voters. So there's a whole spectrum of suppression. So whenever somebody calls up and says, voter suppression doesn't exist, how hard is it to get a voter or to get a voter ID? You know, when you try to create that straw man and you just try to limit it to that one topic, again, what that means is we're not having a discussion around the full range of the voter suppression. When you look at all of these things, what you see is that all of these policies are targeted in a way to impact Black communities, brown communities, younger voters, and other marginalized voters. And by the way, even attacking I don't want to leave out our disabled, our disability community, because the attack on vote by mail and drop boxes often impacts them as well, and that's not talked about enough.
BlackVotersMatterFund.org is the website. Cliff Albright serves as the co-founder and executive director, joining us on Washington Journal this morning. Mr. Albright, thanks for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Coming up, we are going to hear from the Federalist features editors Eleanor Bartow about federal funding of what is known as gain of function research.